In the period between 1947 and 1991, the world was in a state of geopolitical tension after World War II, due to the philosophical polarization between the Western and Eastern blocs. We will discuss the legacy of the Cold War, the repercussions of the Cold War in the Balkan, Middle Eastern, Asian, South American, and African regions, and the significance of NATO in today's world to address the constant anxiety of the Cold War that still exists in our world today. The legacy of the Cold War left many regions of the world in a state of political and economic turmoil, responsible for the organization of NATO that addresses the anxiety of the Cold War that still exists today. It is important to understand the consequences of these geopolitical tensions created in the world due to the Cold War. All the countries of the world, each in their turn, were consumed by the polarizing forces of the Western and Eastern blocs that costed millions of lives to be displaced and destroyed. To this day, we see the efforts to destabilize regions against NATO or the Soviet Union in pursuit of strategic influence to leave entire continents in a stage of complete tyranny. My father grew up under the oppression of the Soviet Communist Union and firsthand experienced the constant narrative that the West sought to exterminate the East and force him and his loved ones into the slavery of capitalists. Always under the constant paranoia that a nuclear war would leave his home and his family in ashes. He understood that America was free and never fell for the radical ideology of the Bulgarian communist government. He came to the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union and met my mother, and teaches me the harsh realities that exist to this day due to the constant division between the world at the time. The Cold War era between 1947 and 1991, when the world was in a state of geopolitical tension after World War II due to the Soviet and NATO blocs, left a legacy of the Cold War. The repercussions of the Cold War left regions of the world in complete turmoil, and the significance of NATO today in the world exists to address this anxiety of the Cold War that still exists today. In the period between 1947 and 1991, the world was in a state of geopolitical tension after World War II due to the philosophical polarization between the Western and Eastern blocs. The Soviet Union and NATO alliances organized propaganda fronts to undermine each other's significance. They staged political engagement in countries that served the two powers' strategic influence and created proxy wars to destabilize regions of the world that would otherwise serve as a puppet to the Soviet or NATO powers. While both powers sought to always maintain the most impressive arsenal of weapons, the geopolitical tensions grew even hotter. This establishes the significance of NATO in today's world, as referenced by the Free Dictionary by Farlex, the Cold War era. The tension existed between the two blocs, and NATO understood that there was no peace. And the turmoil of both powers was consuming the world. In one of Ronald Reagan's famous speeches, 1987, Ronald Reagan says, and I quote, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." One of Ronald Reagan's greatest speeches to Premier Gorbachev. Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States and the leader of the NATO alliance, demands peace through strength. During the Berlin Wall crisis, Reagan condemns the actual physical structure that divided both blocs. The wall and its entirety represented the great difference between the two opposing ideologies. Patrick Major on the Berlin Wall crisis, The View from Below, 2006. By addressing the geopolitical tension of the Cold War, we will now look at the present world and its condition. The repercussions of the Cold War in the Balkan regions, Middle Eastern regions, and South Africa and African regions, it is still evident in the existing condition of the world today. Long pro-American Ethiopia, a pre-industrial country with 50 million people, joined the Soviet camp in 1977 and rewarded with Cuban troops and billions of dollars of military equipment. Washington responded by pumping arms and money into the vacuum and left by Moscow in neighboring Somalia, a desert strip of 6 million nomads. Today, Ethiopia, its 30-year civil war, holds a fragile peace with a government that says it wants to establish a democracy, but it has to receive any of the economic aid that Washington has promised. The former Soviet embassy, once swollen with military attaches and diplomats, is virtually empty. John Perles, 1942. The Bosnian War was an international armed conflict that took place between March 1992 and November 1995. The war involved the Bosnian Federal Republic of Yugoslavia troops, later Serbia and Montenegro, as well as Croatia. Serbia gave military and financial support to the Serbs, which consisted of the Yugoslav People's Army and the Army of Republika Srpska, and the Serbian Ministry of the Interior. The Ministry of the Interior of Republika Srpska and Serb Territorial Defense Forces. Croatia gave military support to Croat forces of the self-proclaimed Croatian community of Hezburg, Bosnia. The Bosnian government forces were led by the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and his involvement of NATO during 1995 Operation Deliberate Force against the positions of the Army of Republika Srpska internationalized the conflict, but it only in its final stages. The war was brought to an end after the signing of the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina in Paris on 14th of December 1995. Peace negotiations were finalized on the 21st of December 1995. The accords were known as the Dayton Agreement. Balkan Military History, 2012. Another example of the Cold War era and its repercussions is, and I quote, "The Cold War struggles are also occurring in the Middle East. Strategically important as a supplier of oil, the region appeared vulnerable in 1946 when Soviet troops failed to leave Iran as promised, even after British and American forces had already withdrawn. The U.S. demanded a United Nations condemnation of Moscow's continued troop presence. When the United States observed Soviet tanks entering the region, Washington readied a direct clash. Confronted by U.S. resolve, the Soviets withdrew their forces to Cold War Asia and the Middle East." End quote. The Korean War brought armed conflicts between the United States and China. The Allies had divided Korea along the 38th parallel after liberating it from Japan and at the end of World War II. The Soviet Union accepted Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel, and the United States did the same in the south. Originally intended as a matter of military convenience, the dividing line became the more rigid as Cold War tensions escalated. Both major powers set up governments in their respective occupation zones and continued to support them even after departing the Cold War Asia of the Middle East. In the old days of the Cold War, the United States would have felt obligated to step in and help, not because we thought these economic policies were sound, but because we sensed that if we did not prop up a populist government, they would be replaced by regimes far more radical, possibly even allied with the Soviet Union. This is a statement by Falkopf on monographs. From the perspective of King Hussein of Jordan, he understood that there would be no independence from the great two powers. In the Soviet Union and NATO alliance, he states, "In the great struggle of communism and freedom, there can be no neutrality." Nigel Ashton, Cold War on the Periphery, the case of King Hussein of Jordan, 2006. The anxiety of the Cold War still exists, and NATO believes the Russian Federation is still aggressive and seeks to reclaim its lost territory. The anxiety of the Cold War exists today. NATO extends its military influence in regions surrounding the Russian Federation in the event Russia seeks to prevail in its domination of the previous Cold War territories. As quoted by Maligno, NATO puts troops on high alert and readiness for confrontation with Russia in 2016. It quotes that the NATO chiefs, thrown into panic and by fears of the Russian President Vladimir Putin might attack the West, after scrambling to put together a force of 300,000 troops, of which they can put on high alert. The legacy of the Cold War is very relevant in the world today. NATO anxiety in the Soviet Union exists in the alert attitude as NATO extends to Russia. The condition of proxy regions is evidence of the turmoil created by the influence of the two powers that brings much significance of NATO in today's world. To finalize, the Cold War legacy emphasizes the need for NATO and the depleted condition of the world's regions today. In the era of the Cold War, 1947-1991, the geopolitical tension after World War II between the Western and Eastern blocs left a legacy of tragedy in the Balkan states, Middle Eastern region, Asian continent, South American continent, and finally the African continent, and proves that the significance in NATO's establishment in today's world stands as proof of the anxiety of the Cold War still exists. With this knowledge of the legacy of the Cold War, we can look at the world and understand the reason why the world is shaped in the way it is today. The Cold War era may be over, and the Eastern Bloc may have fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, but the events of the Cold War show a dark legacy of geopolitical tension and world divide. Thank you.